This terrible crevasse of misgovernment and public debauchery. Now, this election might otherwise seem inconsequential, but it set in motion many things that hastened the final showdown for control of South Carolina. The News and Courier in Charleston wrote that these judges of the Black Belt, in their words, would be the absolute masters of the Low Country, which contained 90,000 voters, and from there they would rule the state. And the quote from the paper was, "Their plan is to Africanize the state and to put the white man under the splay foot of the Negro and hold him there." Now, there's only one solution to this, the editorial concluded. They must pit discipline against discipline, organization against organization. The Democratic Party must be so drilled and ordered that not a single vote shall be lost. And the militaristic vocabulary was not by mistake. And moreover, the term black band referred to in the editorial was a new phrase, and its use was very significant. African Americans were held entirely responsible for the election of Whipper and Moses, and conservatives now clearly drew a color line. No longer in the Democratic press was it the Negro carpetbagger ruled trying to rob the state. There it is. But the black band was now trying to Africanize the state. It was and had always been about racism, but now all other pretense was thrown off. Now, long story short, Chamberlain refuses to sign the commissions of Whipper and Moses on a patently false technicality and was praised by some conservatives for standing up to the radicals of his own party and accomplishing, in the words of one editorialist, a coup d'etat. And even though the Republican governor was selling the soul of his own party to the enemy, because of the Whipper-Moses election, exactly what Chamberlain had feared came to pass. The Democrats came alive. Carolina conservatives had lived under what they deemed an entirely illegitimate outsider and black government, and all of their efforts up until this point to overturn it, violence, fraud, conciliation, alliance, had all failed. 1876 would be different. For rifts in the Republican ranks, changes in Northern sentiment, and a new unity among conservatives created an environment that was ripe for revolution. Whites raised up a banner of white supremacy, again, brandished a blade of paramilitary citizen force. Both had appeared before in Reconstruction, but their use had been sporadic, local, and very often clandestine. Moreover, even federal action against the Klan in the early 1870s had been half-hearted and ineffective in preventing reactionary violence. Washington's actions showed conservatives that federal lacked the political will to turn back these assaults. The 1876 campaign marked the culmination of white organization and mobilization fully in the open. Action moved from the very local to the state and regional level, with thousands of conservative soldiers under the direction of would-be redeemers. Conservatives had watched with interest and mounting hope what was going on in Mississippi, the only other southern state with a black majority. 2 years earlier in Mississippi, the whiteliners, from whom the South Carolina straight-outs derived their inspiration, had pledged themselves to return, quote, the white man to the white man's place and the black man to the black man's place, each according to the eternal fitness of things. To accomplish this, control of the state government held by African Americans and the Republicans had to be broken by any cost and by any means. Moreover, African Americans were to be simultaneously subjected to the most intense, nonviolent pressure that could be brought to bear. Their only out, it was meant to be known, was to join the Democratic Party, where sooner or later they would be expected to vote away their own political power. If the whiteliners failed to persuade African Americans and their Republican allies, they were prepared without scruple to resort to violence. And when the plan was first put to work in Mississippi in the September 1875 elections, the slogan there was, "Carry the election peacefully if we can, forcefully if we must." And they did carry the election, and they did carry it by force. The Republican governor of Mississippi called for federal intervention to protect Republican voters from the white vigilante mobs and rifle clubs and to stop this terrorism. And the president declined. He was cautious of Republican Party politics, and without, he believed, a national consensus of support. Realistically, Democratic control of Congress after 1874, there wasn't going to be any more federal intervention. Congress could no longer be relied on to engage in things like that. And to be sure, even in 1871, when Washington might have seemed more willing, the number of Klansmen who were rounded up, tried, and convicted of their crimes was minimal. No one served more than 5 years for any Klan crimes, and all of them were free and out by 1876. In South Carolina, as the Democrats began to organize during that winter and spring, the straight-outs were bent on following the Mississippi plan to the letter, and they hoped to the same exact end, especially after having learned the lesson that they would be likely free from federal interference. Opposed to this side of the Democratic Party, who represented the extreme and in some cases fanatical element, There were more conservative cooperationists who believed that the wisest course was to return the cooperationist Daniel Chamberlain to the State House, and that therefore the Democrats should not run a candidate against him. The devil you know, right? Their argument had many merits, not least of which was that Chamberlain seemed to be practically unbeatable in a fair election. This was a state where African Americans had at least a 30,000 voting majority. But the straight outs countered, there is an option. They do have a chance if enough African Americans can either be won over to the Democratic Party, which seemed unlikely, or prevented from voting at all. The Mississippi Plan had obviously worked in Mississippi. They had an even larger black population than South Carolina did. The first test of this plan in South Carolina came in July, Independence Day. The normally sleepy town of Hamburg on the Carolina side of the Savannah River, there occurred a bloody incident which some Democrats, men like Pitchfork, Ben Tillman, later remembered changed the courses of their lives. I'm not going to get too much into the details of Hamburg, except to say that what begins as an innocuous confrontation between two white farmers going one way on a road and an all-black militia drilling in that same road heightens racial tensions, devolves into, by design, an opportunity for dozens of armed white vigilantes to sweep into the town, a cannon in tow to wage a one-sided battle that leaves at least 7 dead, 4 of whom were African-American militiamen who were executed on the spot in cold blood. 94 white men were indicted there at Hamburg for murder by a coroner's jury. None were prosecuted. The events catalyzed the parties and swept them into the election of 1876. Both sides recognized now that a new chapter in the struggle for political control over the state had begun. Republicans began to cast off their divisions, but worried that it might be too late. Days after Hamburg, the Democratic Executive Committee deemed it, in their words, necessary and expedient to call a convention of the party to meet within the month to seize the initiative and nominate a full slate of state officers with former Confederate General Wade Hampton to top the ticket for governor. Though Hampton feigned to acknowledge that there might actually be a high road where peaceful campaigning might carry the day, his supporters and campaign entourage suggested otherwise. This would be a campaign in the original meaning of the term. The state, in their words, would be seized from the hands of the usurpers. Control would be taken, etc. The straight outs under the leadership of Alexander Haskell and Martin Witherspoon Gary easily took control of the Democratic Party machinery. Clearly, Gary, who at the end of the Civil War had delivered over his command to a subordinate while shouting, "South Carolinians never surrender," and then galloped off the field, led the most dangerous element in the party. Their racist views, violent nature augured for a very deadly campaign to come. His plan, although never formally accepted as campaign strategy, which he creatively called number one plan of the campaign, listed 33 items necessary to winning the election. A lot of these were very obvious. Make sure that every Democrat is registered to vote. But more telling points were left off of the public copies that were circulated about, and the party operatives had other instructions. For instance, all Democratic clubs needed to be armed and equipped to the extent of having a supply wagon on hand fully stocked in case that club needed to camp out at a poll for a few days, for instance. Gary wanted whites that you never threaten a man individually. If he deserves to be threatened, the necessity of the times require that he should die. Every Democrat had to control the vote of one black man, quote, by intimidation, purchase, or keeping him away from the polls. With Hampton as the candidate, and men like Gary, the political organizers, all conservative factions were united and aroused to fight for their desperately desired objective, the return of a white supremacist government to South Carolina. The newly achieved unity of the Democrats was not quite paralleled by the Republicans when they met September the 14th for their nominating convention, although the party had to a large extent closed ranks behind Daniel Chamberlain. The militaristic bombast of the conservatives, however, worried them considerably. Immediately after his own nomination, Chamberlain received a letter from 2 friends. The letter offered congratulations and then turned quite solemn. The authors hoped that you will live to see long enough the expiration of your term. It would be idle words to express our feelings like hope and a wish of peaceful administration when we are on the very eve of war. Now, the eve of war was inaccurate. Blood had been shed and mobs were mobilizing for the further attack. General Hampton marched across the state at the head of a literal army of supporters beginning in early September of 1876. And though he made vague assurances to African Americans about their safety and in some attempt to attract their votes, Hampton turned a blind eye to the violent measures simultaneously being used to neutralize this 30,000 vote black majority. Rifle clubs had, of course, been in existence since the mid-1860s, 1867, but by the summer of 76, they had multiplied to an estimated nearly 300 different organizations, with an average of 50 men in each company. This meant that plus or minus 15,000 were under arms in South Carolina, and that's a number that might represent the majority of the male population within the ordinary limits of fighting military age. On the local level, members were listed on rosters according to their company of service in the Confederate Army. One of the primary functions of these well-drilled rifle clubs was to lead a campaign of what they termed divided meetings, or breaking up Republican political meetings. At Edgefield, Chamberlain faced such a confrontation when he addressed a Republican meeting in August. As he mounted the stand, Matthew Butler and Martin Gary, backed by an estimated 500 red shirts, elbowed their way onto the rostrum, and amid yells, denounced, harassed, and threatened the Republicans on the stage and the Republicans in the audience. And similar occurrences followed when Chamberlain attempted to speak in Newberry, Abbeville, Barnwell, Lancaster, et cetera, et cetera. By promoting these divided meetings, the Democrats made conditions too hazardous and humiliating for Chamberlain and other Republican office seekers to continue their canvass of the state. And when they did manage to brave it to a meeting, they encountered small crowds because Republicans were afraid to come out to these political meetings and expose themselves to such treatment. At a rally near Charleston, one red shirt selected a black man, as of course all members of the Democratic Party were meant to do, and told him, quote, "You see this gun? It carries 16 balls and is loaded full. My orders are to stick to you all day, and if any trouble is started here, shoot you until you're dead. First thing, and I'm gonna do it." By October, the outrages committed against terrorized African Americans were numerous. Outright murders had multiplied to crisis proportions. After another riot in Ellington in Aiken County, about 20 miles southeast of Hamburg, Chamberlain declared that it had become, quote, "impractical to enforce by ordinary process of judicial proceedings the laws of the state." Accordingly, on October the 7th of 1876, the governor ordered all rifle clubs to disband and all members to disperse peacefully to their homes within 3 days. He never anticipated compliance. He intended that his actions would serve then as a constitutional precursor for requesting federal assistance. The Democrats responded with a document they titled Proclamation to the People of the United States. In it, they asserted that, quote, "In this period of profound peace, Chamberlain's false and libelous charge, his tyrannical, unwarranted usurpation of power, was undertaken solely to prevent the otherwise certain defeat of him and his corrupt party." This is fake news, they said. As had been expected, the rifle clubs ignored the governor's order. Or, in an open show of defiance, many reported to the governor that, yes, we've obeyed your order, and they clearly had no intention of doing so. The Allendale Rifle Club, for instance, reorganized itself as the Allendale Mounted Baseball Club. The Columbia Flying Artillery announced that it has reorganized itself as the Columbia Musical Club with 4 12-pounder flutes. Intimidation continued apace, and Chamberlain appeared completely impotent. With all other options having failed, the governor appealed directly to the president. And on October the 17th, Grant, who recognized a state of insurrection now and domestic violence in South Carolina, issued a proclamation and commanded, quote, "all persons engaged in said unlawful and insurrectionary proceedings to disperse and retire peacefully to their respective abodes." The Democratic Executive Committee then responded, "We cannot retire peacefully to our abodes because we are in our homes in peace, disturbed only by the political agitations created by the governor and his minions." The president, through General Sherman, then ordered all available forces in Military Division of the Atlantic to report to Columbia to reinforce the 8 United States companies already on duty in South Carolina. And federal troops, a little over 1,000 men, arrived 3 weeks before the election, were distributed throughout the state, and from all reports did an even-handed job of maintaining order. This was a small victory for Chamberlain. And the state faced election with more U.S. soldiers present than at any time since its readmission to the Union, and this is including the period of the Ku Klux Klan operations in 1870, 1871. The campaign, though, had already demonstrated who was in physical brute control of South Carolina. The election which was to come would serve only to validate Wade Hampton's authority. There was no doubt whatsoever that fraud and intimidation by both parties occurred at polling places in South Carolina. There was also less doubt that the Democrats had far outreached the Republicans to that extent. Even the most partisan Democratic observers not only admitted that they cheated, but actually boasted of it publicly. Democrats realized that they could make little impact in the low country, where the black majorities were the largest. Therefore, they knew they had to win big and win big in the upcountry. Two areas there were key to their strategy and became vital points of issues in the chaos which followed. In Edgefield and Lawrence, both in the northwest part of the state, Democrats went far afield to stuff ballot boxes, bringing over folks from Georgia, having people younger than 18 voting, people voting twice. The result, though, was that Gary and his men were ultimately too successful in targeting these areas. Hampton and the Democratic slate ended up receiving more votes than there were registered voters of both parties. The Republican-controlled election commission in those counties declared the totals fraudulent. Because of those irregularities, under the 1868 Constitution, the General Assembly would then be in place to elect the governor. That was also problematic because the makeup of the South Carolina House of Representatives was itself contested over suspicions of fraud. The ultimate duty of certifying these returns as received from the various county managers in order to proclaim the winners at the state and then the national level fell to the State Board of Canvassers. Long story short with them, because I was just given the 5. The State Board of Canvassers were made up almost entirely of Republicans, 3 of which were running for office. Democrats realized what was going on, asked the Supreme Court to order the State Board of Canvassers only to look on the face of the returns. The board meets before the order from the Supreme Court can arrive and then adjourns, and they essentially declare that, believe it or not, the Republicans win. So what ends up happening is that the Republican Board of Canvassers has declared Republicans winners in all these contested elections. Democrats continue to howl and claim their own victory. So November 28th, which was the day set aside for the convening of the legislature, there's a lot of excitement in Columbia. People were milling around to see what was going to happen. Democrats had promised to take that chamber by force. Few people were aware that during the previous night, Chamberlain had, without any authority, actually ordered the commander of the federal troops to move a company of infantry into the State House, which he unquestionably did. So troops were already in place inside when the Democrats were staged to take the House. So at 12 o'clock, the Democratic members-elect began march from South Carolina Hall, which is on Main Street not far away, to the Capitol grounds 2 by 2. The members, which they said claimed were elected from Edgefield to Lawrence, were in the front. Wade Hampton was coming up the rear. They entered the State House, but were met at the door by the Sergeant-at-Arms of the House of Representatives, where they were stopped and asked for their certificates of election. Naturally, the people at the beginning of the line from Lawrence and Edgefield did not have them, so they about-face, turned back around, and went back to South Carolina Hall. When they got there, the Democratic members who actually held certificates, plus the 8 who did not, unilaterally declared themselves to be the legal House of Representatives of the state of South Carolina and elected General William Wallace as their speaker. Meanwhile, at the State House, the Republican members proceeded to organize themselves as the legal House of Representatives, and they elected E.W.M. Mackey as their speaker. And they were in actual possession of the House chamber, so they seemed to have a slight advantage at the moment, but not for very long. The Democrats of the Wallace House allowed 1 day to elapse to let the dust settle, possibly lull their opponents into a false sense of security, and then made a fresh assault on the State House. They were determined to storm their way into the House of Representatives by force if necessary. Now, whether or not the troops received new orders, whether or not the doorkeepers were confused, as Democrats claimed they overpowered them, the Wallace House actually gained admission to the chamber with comparative ease on November the 30th, which was Thanksgiving Day. The Mackey House was in recess, having their Thanksgiving dinners. Wallace then moved to the speaker's desk. His clerk moved into the clerk's chair. The Democratic members took seats on the right-hand side of the chamber, and then they proceeded to do business, or at least make a show of doing so. And a few moments later, the Mackey House returns from their recess, shocked at what they see. Their jaws hit the floor. Mackey has relative good peace of mind at this point. He walks up to the speaker's desk, demands of General Wallace, "Sir, will you please vacate this seat?" And Wallace replied in the negative. I'm not sure what he said, but it was probably some choice words. Mackey then orders his sergeant-at-arms to bring another chair, place it beside Wallace. The Republican members move into the occupied seats on the left-hand side of the chamber. Both speakers rap for order. The 2 houses of representatives go into session at the same time and in the same place. It was an amazing scene. Each speaker recognized only members of his own house. Motions were made simultaneously, each side trying to be heard over the voices of the members of the other side, while at the same time trying to catch the gist of what the other side was saying. Because neither faction dared to call a recess and risk losing physical possession of the chamber, the famous dual house stayed in session for 4 days and 4 nights. Food was brought in, as were blankets and pillows, as were weapons and ammunition, even though every man was already armed to the teeth. Now, if this had somehow occurred in isolation, this might suggest a humorous scene. But in fact, for 4 days and 4 nights, the South Carolina State House was a hair's breadth away from outright battle on the House floor. Now, this farce lasted from November 30th to December the 4th, when Democrats, while never actually disclaiming their claim to the House, withdrew. Wade Hampton had supposedly received a letter the day before which claimed that Chamberlain was going to bring in a gang of 100 African-American roughs known as the Hunky-Dories into the State House to eject the Democrats. Any show of force of defense by the Democrats would bring on federal interference, and they just didn't want that. The letter was probably false. The threats it contained appeared to be without substantial basis, but the Democrats were probably prudent to clear out when they did. Hunky-Dories or not, the situation of the dual house could not have remained under control much longer. With the Wallace House out of the way, the Republican members of the Mackey House immediately moved into joint session with the state Senate, which was undisputably Republican controlled. By throwing out the votes of Edgefield and Lawrence, the combined legislature ruled that Chamberlain had won with 86,620 votes to Hampton's 85,521. 3 days later, on December the 7th, Chamberlain was inaugurated. 1 week after that, the Wallace House, having adjudged Hampton the winner by 92,261 to 91,127, including Edgefield and Lawrence, inaugurated him as the governor. And immediately after Hampton's inauguration as governor by his Democrats, he demanded that Chamberlain deliver up to him the Great Seal of the state together with possession of the State House. Chamberlain refused. I do not recognize you in any right to make the foregoing demand. Now, of course, the national election was no more certain than the South Carolina gubernatorial race. South Carolina was faced with the unparalleled situation of having 2 chief executives. The United States faced the extraordinary circumstance of having none. That, of course, was settled by the Compromise of 1877, which in a way also resolved the South Carolina standoff. In much simplified terms, never explicitly stated, but implicitly and widely understood, Southerners eventually expressed their willingness not to block Hayes's election by filibustering if the Republicans would promise several concessions, most important of which to this discussion was the removal of federal troops from the South. This compromise led to the formal declaration 2 days before the inaugural date of Rutherford B. Hayes as the 19th President of the United States. April the 3rd, President Hayes made good on the first of these compromises. He informed Chamberlain that now all federal troops would be withdrawn on April the 10th, essentially handing over the last remaining Southern state back into Democratic hands. The complete loss of federal support, plus the well-reasoned counsel of his Republican advisors, left Chamberlain with little choice but to capitulate. On the same day, he renounced his office. He issued an address called Address to the Republicans of South Carolina, and he bitterly excoriated Rutherford B. Hayes. Today, April 10th, 1877, by order of the President whom your votes alone rescued from overwhelming defeat, the government of the United States abandons you, deliberately withdraws from you its support, and by the withdrawal of troops now protecting the state from domestic violence, abandons the lawful government of the state to a struggle with insurrectionary forces too powerful to be resisted. Other black representatives and elected officials were forced from office, kept from claiming their seats, or declared new losers based on fraudulent but now accepted Democratic vote counts. So Reconstruction was over in South Carolina, or the effects of fruits of Reconstruction were not necessarily over, but the active attempts to reconstruct and not just maintain or make the best of bad situations were done. The freedoms that initially put African Americans into the state legislature, into Congress, into different elected positions, allowed them to vote, allowed them to serve on juries, enabled them to own businesses, were now undermined by vigilante violence. Reconstruction had not failed. Reconstruction had been defeated, overthrown by a violent and fraudulent election on the heels of years of violence and followed by a bloodless coup d'etat. Reconstruction represented a continuation of the long Civil War. Former Confederates led terrorist units made up in large part by former Confederates. As Vernon has pointed out to be many times, men far too young to have fought in the 1861 to 65 Civil War did later serve in terrorist paramilitary groups in the wars of Reconstruction, later applied for states' Confederate Civil War pensions. They knew that their fighting hadn't ended at Appomattox. Maintaining that war, or more accurately, a campaign of domestic terrorism, was necessary to prevent African Americans and whites from continuing to successfully work together, from maintaining success in the project of interracial democracy. Indeed, the extent of brutality and violence reflected an acknowledgement that the strength of that democracy had been so great. If Reconstruction hadn't been killed, it may not have died. What might have been can only be suggested by what was, But the fate of Reconstruction was always contingent. The work only ended, not unfinished. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I want to thank Vernon and all of the Burtons of many different generations for all of their hospitality and for having us here. And I want to thank Peter for all of his work in the task of getting us here and hopefully getting us to go when they've had their fun with us. In 1880, speaking on West Indian Day in Elmira, New York, Frederick Douglass rued the collapse of Reconstruction and the triumph of the counter-revolution. The old master class is today triumphant, he said. Our Reconstruction measures were radically defective. For Douglass, grieving Reconstruction's limits meant mourning not just the limits of the era, but arguably of liberal democracy itself, to transform society or even to protect citizens' rights. He contemplated the gloomy possibility that Reconstruction revealed not just a flaw in the American character, though he was certainly open to that, but in the American constitutional system. Although Douglass, in his speech, paid homage to what he described as a peaceful transition of West Indian emancipation, not all scholars would see it that way now, he contrasted that to the usual fate of mankind, a fate that the Civil War likewise proved, the interdependence of force and freedom, the idea that rights might always depend on rifles. He said, great and valuable concessions have in different ages been made to the liberties of mankind, but they have, however, come not at the command of reason and persuasion, but by the sharp and terrible edge of the sword. And the withdrawal of that sword was that he feared meant the withdrawal of Reconstruction. Looking gloomily from a world away on his tour of Asia, and from not a world away, but a partial world away politically, former President Ulysses S. Grant came to a somewhat similar conclusion in the late 1870s, telling a reporter looking back over the whole policy of Reconstruction, it seems to me that the wisest thing would have been to have continued for some time military rule. The trouble about military rule in the South was that our people did not like it. Douglass and Grant each pointed to two intertwined issues I'll try and discuss briefly and in broad terms today. First, that Reconstruction had been a genuine revolution, meaning that, in terms I take from recent work in social science studies of revolution, especially Jack Goldstone's synthesis, it achieved fundamental, permanent transformation of a political and economic order by, and this is crucial to my definition, forcible and violent methods. Although common and popular ideas of revolution often center either on ideology, origins, or on outcomes, I emphasize methods. The methods that explain how the second founding that Eric Foner has addressed and will come out in his book next year, how it came into being. 1860s Republicans used martial law, military governance, Washington ultimatums, and what can best be, most optimistically be described as congressional fast footwork to create new states and to force states to transform the Constitution in ways unimaginable in the 1850s and unsustainable through normal constitutional means. They were no respecter of norms. In fact, they thought norms preserved oppression. Republicans passed a series of post-war amendments by military force, recreated property and labor relations in the South in one of the largest property seizures in world history, and engineered longer-lasting changes through occupation. And the Civil War thus represented not the fulfillment of the old Constitution, but its at least partial destruction. But I'll also use this paper to reflect upon another aspect of Douglass's and Grant's separate late 1870s despair. The idea that the revolution had ended. If revolutions emerged in revolutionary time, in moments when forcible and fundamental change was possible through normally unavailable mechanisms, then a return to normal governance, a return to constitutionalism was by definition a finish of the revolutionary moment. And so at the end of my talk, I'll reflect a bit on the implications of historians' ideas, long held and well described, but in the idea of Reconstruction as an unfinished revolution, as a way of attaching revolution to aspirations, and what we might gain by the painful act of pondering abandoning that framework and language, and instead considering the revolution of Reconstruction had concluded in the late 19th century, and that the transformations of the United States in the 20th century might be less an extension of Reconstruction than a separate moment. And so to take a step back and to think about the present uses of Reconstruction as an unfinished revolution, to think about why we return to it, and to think about that if we wish transformations at this present moment, to think about how we use reconstructions to think through the possibility of fundamental transformation of the United States system. So through this, I hope my paper pays tribute to Vernon's own lifelong commitment to using history to think through our contemporary problems and to think through our contemporary world in order to try to change it. Now, I should say that there's nothing at all new about calling the Civil War era a Reconstruction. Journalists and politicians started to do so even before Fort Sumter. And many Civil War and Reconstruction historians have used the language, either to praise the transformative impact, especially on African Americans, in work of W.B. Du Bois, Eric Foner, Steve Hahn, Julie Saville, Ira Berlin, many, many others, or on the United States economic system. But interestingly and worryingly, though, the historians who most frequently look at revolutionary methods, forcible and violence, were not the champions of Reconstructions, but the critics. People like William Dunning, Claude Bowers, who denounced bayonet rule, martial law, and other violent methods. They saw used to remake the South, to them illegitimately, in the Constitution. Current historians, many in this room, have overturned that bleak judgment of Reconstruction, but sometimes at the expense of looking past the methods, perhaps because of the jarring disconnect between means and ends that the violent and extra-legal methods of Reconstruction reveal. And so we have a tension. The more people like Reconstruction, the less they want to examine its methods. And the more they examine its methods, the less likely they are to be people who like Reconstruction. What I want to do is to reevaluate those methods, not as a way of denouncing them, but of analyzing the underlying position. What if Reconstruction was both extra-constitutional and necessary? What does that tell us about the failure of the Constitution and of the US system, rather than about the failure of Reconstruction? Now, to go through all the events that constitute these methods is to risk retelling the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and to risk repeating what many people in this room already know, as I'm not suggesting a discovery of new facts, but new ways of organizing what would be for historians somewhat familiar facts. But I also, before I go into that, want to acknowledge an irony of treating Reconstruction as a revolution, one that continues to puzzle Americans, that the Civil War's revolution came even though most Americans, indeed most Republicans, claim not to be revolutionaries. It was the situation itself that moved previously moderate people to revolutionary action, just as other situations moved self-styled revolutionaries to reformism. These actions began, however, with the suspension of the privilege of habeas corpus, the imposition of martial law in the war's first days, first in Maryland to prevent that state from seceding, then into Virginia and other occupied parts of the Confederacy as the war began. Slaves forced the United States to reckon with constitutional time as they paddled to US forces in Fort Monroe. And martial law, imposed first to save the Union, quickly became a tool to end slavery. At first, these changes were temporary and thus not revolutionary. But over 1862, the United States turned to permanently attacking slavery through mechanisms of martial law. And as Congress attacked slavery in 1862, it also necessarily began to remake the country's fundamental political system. Congress, on the Supreme Court, Congress expanded it, later it would retract it. It changed the nature of the Union by rushing in West Virginia in seeming violation of constitutional rules. When Senator Lyman Trumbull asked if Congress should take such a permanent action as to add a state permanently to the United States in the present unsettled condition of the country, Ben Wade dismissed it. Now is the time for great events, when you see that a commotion within the land has been brought it within the compass of your power. In 1864, Republicans created Nevada and tried to bring Colorado and Nebraska in, specifically, James Ashley said, to give them extra votes in the Electoral College. These states then provided a margin to pass the 13th Amendment through Congress, and Republicans rejected Democratic arguments that a fractional Congress could not remake the Constitution. When Robert E. Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, he therefore knew exactly what he was asking for when he asked Ulysses S. Grant for peace. For he and Grant both understood that peace at that moment, with the 13th Amendment not ratified, with something on the order of 2.5 million people still held in slavery behind Confederate lines, peace would mean the restoration or the acknowledgement of Confederates' legal authority over the vast area of the South that had not, the Confederacy that had not been occupied. But against American myths of peace at Appomattox, Ulysses S. Grant repeatedly rejected peace, pledged to attack if Lee didn't withdraw his request for peace, and demanded that he only offer surrender, something ratified by Andrew Johnson after the assassination of Lincoln, and unanimously by the cabinet, that the United States war could not end at Appomattox because the constitutional work of ending slavery had not been concluded. By sustaining war, the United States retained the power to occupy the defeated Confederacy and rule it by military force. And that is precisely what it tried to do, as I'll show you on my digital site, Mapping Occupation, that I created with Scott Nesbitt and with the aid of a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. As you can see here, these dots represent where U.S. forces are, and as they move into different zones over 1865. And a movement over 1865, you can also plot it if those of you are teachers, against different census, railroads, something we call zones of occupation, how far people could reach based on their own access to railroads, how far people could go to reach U.S. soldiers. And you can see that over 1865, into the winter of 1865 to 66, U.S. Army presence expands through the South after Confederate surrender. From about 120 posts in April 1865, the U.S. eventually occupied more than 630, reaching deep into the countryside to places like Gillisonville, Grahamville, Pocatelligo, McPhersonville, all in South Carolina, and to establish itself as a supervisory government regulating criminal law and the peace. The Army had to occupy the countryside because the South remained a rural society. Freedom depended upon access to forest and plantation districts, the swords that Frederick Douglass said created much lasting change in the world. Now, of course, on site, the interactions between the Army and freed people were varied, sometimes oppressive, sometimes horrifying. My point is not that the Army always had good intentions, or even often. My argument is that the Army's presence created a political countervailing force to planters, to planter power. The Army did not teach freed people about freedom, as generations of scholars have explained. Freed people had their own ideas, but the Army was there to teach planters, and thus the movement into the countryside, the reading aloud of orders to planters. Then Congress sustained revolutionary time in December 1865 by refusing to seat or even to consider representatives from the ex-rebel states, and to sustain the military's ultimate authority in the South despite Andrew Johnson's halting efforts to restore peace. This fragment of a Congress then extended the Freedmen's Bureau, passed a Civil Rights Act that seemed to go beyond existing congressional authority, and in defense of it, Senator Lott Morrill said, "I admit this species of legislation is absolutely revolutionary, but are we not in the midst of a revolution?" And then the 14th Amendment, which passed a Congress that excluded 11 out of 36 states, leading Johnson to question the amendment's constitutional validity. When ex-Confederate states when Congress rejected the 14th Amendment, Congress put them back under military rule and military Reconstruction in March 1867, and ordered the Army to register black male adult residents and create new state constitutions, and then to use those new governments to ratify the 14th Amendment. On the 14th Amendment, only 19 non-Confederate states both ratified it and sustained it, well short of the necessary 28. And 3 of those 19 had been added, states had been added by fractional Congresses. To get to the necessary 28, the remaining votes came from states under military rule. You cannot find an instance where so great a revolution has been wrought with equal success, quote Alabama Republican Senator Willard Warner. When Ulysses S. Grant was elected president in 1868, the New York Herald called it the crowning point of our Second American Revolution, as the United States was changed utterly by the expurgation of the old Constitution founded upon slavery. Grant would continue the work of making a new Constitution by forcing the last few rebel states to ratify the 15th Amendment under threat of martial law. This was not simple reform, but a violent, permanent remaking of the reunited nation's political system. On the 15th Amendment, Republicans again relied on 6 states that had been under military rule, then restored in 1868, plus the 4 that remained under military rule in 1869 in order to add the amendment to the Constitution. But that wasn't all they did. To sustain their revolutionary project, Republicans sheared away the power of the Supreme Court, shifting its composition, expanding its size during the war, then reducing its size and eliminating part of its jurisdiction to prevent it from hearing the McArdle case. They expelled a sitting senator to preserve their constitutional majority, and in other ways altered the arrangements of government. And on the ground, free people and military commanders fought an ongoing revolution against planners for control of state governments, forcibly evicting governors in several states, overruling laws and others. This revolution then met an increasingly well-organized counter-revolution between 1868 and 1875, and then a Democratic Party determined to shear away military power nationally between 1875 and 1880, as Heather Cox Richardson and others have argued. Even with the counter-revolution's success, parts of the revolution remain not just in the parchment guarantees of the amendment, but in the actual experiences of freedom, including the property owner accumulation that Adrian and Mark spoke about yesterday. It is important to acknowledge caveats. Republicans found, sometimes highly original, justifications for their arguments in constitutional or congressional rules. And yet, over the course of the 1860s, an increasing number of Republicans, including those who had rejected the label of revolutionary early in the war, came to accept that what they were doing went beyond any sense of established order or norms. We are passing through a great revolution, Congressman Ulysses Mercure said, and we have not yet reached the end. It is striking to how many Republicans began to imagine even bolder transformations. John Bingham, no wild-eyed revolutionary, suggested eliminating the Supreme Court entirely. 350 constitutional amendments were proposed in Congress between December 1865 and March 1871, 17 times more than the entire 1850s. There are other caveats, though, to thinking about Reconstruction as a revolution. Those who argued for women's suffrage found it a bitterly disappointing one, as did those who hoped for permanent land redistribution and other revolutionaries. Like other revolutions, the Second American Revolution did not change everything. But the more significant caveat lies in the piece that connects to my second point about a finished revolution. Because Republicans, by and large, did not imagine themselves as in a state of permanent revolution. They were not, by and large, utopians. They were also not, by and large, critics of the way the American system had worked in the North. They wanted temporary revolutionary time to remake the Constitution and to use that to force Southern states to echo the North and then to exit back into peacetime. This reflects both a general sense of moderation, but also their historical judgment that the French Revolution's problem was not that it was too radical, but that it was too ineffective, that a permanent revolution would end inevitably in overthrow, though of course they found that an impermanent one would also. So they hoped then to finish revolutionary time and to exit back into new what they hoped would be stable normalcy. So Reconstruction was thus a finished revolution, as Douglass and Grant each distinctly recognized by the late 1870s. It had emerged in a period when extra-legal force could override legal limits, and now that period had ended. Now that saying that it is finished does not mean, of course, that it was complete. Certainly not if we judge it against their own aspirations, certainly not if we judge it against ours. But it was complete as a historical period. Wartime ended, normalcy resumed. To think of Reconstruction as a finished revolution then asks us to think of it as part of history, not as a prelude to the civil rights movement, not as this moment we can return to, but as an epic with its own rise and fall. And thus to think of the transformations of the 1930s to 1960s as the products of a different historical moment, one that sometimes used creatively the language of the Second Revolution, but perhaps could have proceeded by other ways, perhaps might have proceeded by better ways. if 20th century Americans had been forced to acknowledge the constitutional limits that they worked within and to undo them. Still, the idea of Reconstruction as a revolution and as a finished one rub against key ways that Americans think about their government and their Constitution. For non-scholars, seeing the Civil War as a revolution at all can be painful and disconcerting. It threatens the myth of continuity and stability so central to American mythology. The idea that there are guardrails. To see the failure of the first Constitution and First Republic is to confront the idea that the constitutional road we travel has no guardrails, and that the edge of the road may in fact be a cliff. And it may in fact be a cliff that we drive over. For historians are much more comfortable with that assertion, but the idea of a finished revolution rubs against certain long-standing, deeply honorable and productive aspects of U.S. history, of U.S. historiography. But I want to argue that at least threatening, poking at that idea, may help turn Reconstruction back to a window to the past, from a mirror of ourselves. An unfinished revolution threatens to become a set of wishes, an unrealized and unrealizable ideal. And it threatens not to become a revolution at all if we substitute goals for the methods that address them. It risks encouraging scholars to have their cake and eat it too, to want all the gains of revolutionary time without confronting the idea that those gains depended upon shattering norms and relying on martial law. Reconstruction, thus, I believe, should force us scholars into our own reflections about what U.S. governance can and cannot achieve in the normal course of events, to ask ourselves how far we would be willing to go in transgressing norms or relying upon force to create changes we would like to see, to ask us to reflect upon why we label Republicans moderates when they utilize methods that would be unthinkable to most historians today. Perhaps those reflections would encourage historians and the broader public to consider the need for a greater constitutional reformation today and to consider its present inadequacy. Instead of calling for the roughs or claiming that current disfranchisement or discrimination violates the Constitution or general norms, perhaps we should be bolder in articulating a new Constitution or new norms, new amendments, just to name some obvious ones that all would have occurred to Republicans in the 1860s, positively guaranteeing the right to vote, positively guaranteeing public financing of elections, creating new states, contemplating Supreme Court expansion or reform, replacing the Electoral College, creating national standards for proportional representation. This embrace of constitutional boldness is one way I believe we may approach what I would call not Lincoln's unfinished work, but our unfinished work. Thank you.
So good morning. My paper will overlap in some interesting ways with Greg's, including at least one exact quote. I hope I did. And like everybody else, I want to start with thanks to the Burtons and to Peter for the organization of this conference. Yesterday, there was a lot of talk of FOBs, Friends of Burton. I think I may be the oldest FOB in the room, except maybe for Georgianne. I don't know exactly the moment when I met Vernon, but it might have been in the archives. We were both graduate students, thought we were on the cutting edge of the new social history, doing community studies, and found out we were working on the same damn county. The graduate student's ultimate nightmare. You pick your topic, zoom into it, and somebody is just ahead of you. But Vernon, being Vernon, didn't think of me as a competitor, but as a fellow toiler in the archives, advancing history. Disagreements might be disagreements, but we were all sort of in the same line of work. And that's been true, which is one reason why he was able to assemble this really quite incredible group of people to talk about Reconstruction, or, excuse me, Lincoln's unfinished work. So in my case, recent historiography of the Reconstruction era has been marked by a huge expansion in what we might think of as its boundaries, based in large part on the work of people in this room. We now think of Reconstruction as west of Appomattox, a Reconstruction in a country without borders, a Reconstruction that is part of a global era of nation building and war. But today I'm going to take a rather old-fashioned look at Reconstruction, and given the theme of the conference, partly choosing points of view, I want to talk about Reconstructions. I think Abraham Lincoln on the one hand and Southern whites and blacks on the other hand thought of what the problem of Reconstruction, what the work of Reconstruction was. So a few minutes on each of those. Except when they intruded directly on the goal of saving the Union by winning the war, Abraham Lincoln did not focus much on the West or on Northern economic or social issues, or with what was happening beyond the borders of the United States. At the end of his life, as he declared in his last speech, the sole object of the government, quote unquote, in regard to what he referred to as the seceded states, so-called, was to get them back into their proper practical relation with the Union. And his efforts to do that were remarkably consistent throughout the war. As early as the spring of 1861 in Virginia, Lincoln sought to reestablish a loyal government in the state. He did this at one time or another in North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Florida, Texas, and Alabama, and of course in Louisiana, which was actually the specific subject of that April 11th speech on Reconstruction. He rarely spoke of Reconstruction as a word. In that last speech, he used the phrase, Reconstruction, as the phrase goes. He spoke instead of restoration. There was a good deal of trial and error in his approach, but Lincoln pursued a pretty consistent set of policies. In each state, his idea was a core of loyal Unionists, he eventually settled on 10% of the 1860 voting population, would establish a loyal government, hold elections, and send members to Congress. That core would become the nucleus, as he called it repeatedly. That would attract a growing number of Southern whites as they grew disenchanted with the Confederacy and what Lincoln imagined as their latent loyalty to the Union would come to the fore. They would be encouraged by a generous program of amnesty, with even Confederate officials and officers able to win pardon for their rebellion. Of course, Lincoln eventually decided that emancipation of Confederate slaves was necessary to save the Union. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, he was insistent that the abolition of slavery in the seceded states had to be an essential part of that work of restoring the Union. That is, restoring those states, as he said over and over again, to their practical, proper relation to the Union. But there would be no trials of traitors, no confiscation of property aside from the slaves, and the restoration would be undertaken not with bayonets and under dictation from Washington, he thought, but by those newly loyal citizens of the southern states, white citizens. He remained committed, in the words of another William C. Harris, to the principle of self-reconstruction controlled by Southern whites who were Unionists. His message to the people of the Confederacy was that if they lay down their arms and, quote, again send senators and representatives to Congress, they would at once, he continued, find themselves at peace with no institution changed. Even in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, the purpose, he said, was to practically restoring the constitutional relation between the United States and each of the rebel states. He repeatedly urged Congress to seat representatives and senators that had been chosen in elections held by these rump governments, controlled by martial law, as Greg Down said, that had managed to hold some reasonable semblance of an election during the war. That indeed was the theme of his final speech. He was pushing for Congress to seat representatives and senators from the state of Louisiana. Beyond that, he said, he would, quote, avoid both the substance and appearance of dictation. Lincoln, that is, adhered to his fundamental conservatism when it came to his understanding of the Constitution, that local government, meaning state government, must determine local policy. And this included local policy for what would happen to those people formerly enslaved. If by 1863 he was insisting that states returning to the proper practical relations in slavery, it was still up to the loyal white citizens of those states to decide what would happen to those former slaves. He did advise them to provide for the education of the freedmen, but he also said on multiple occasions that he would find perfectly acceptable some temporary arrangement falling somewhere between slavery and freedom for this, quote, laboring, landless, and homeless class. On another occasion, he advised, quote, some practical system by which the two races could gradually live themselves out of their old relation to each other and both come out the better for the new. At other times, he wrote with approval of, quote, systems of apprenticeship for the colored people, conforming substantially to the most approved plans for gradual emancipation. Famously, after meeting with a delegation of free people of color from New Orleans, he did decide that it would be appropriate if some of the colored people were admitted to the right of suffrage. Quote, for instance, the very intelligent, and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks. He reiterated this preference in that final speech on Reconstruction, saying, quote, I myself prefer that the elective franchise were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. But he always presented this option as something to be decided by the newly loyal governments, by white Southerners, that is, rather than dictated to them by himself. In the words of Lincoln biographer Don Fehrenbacher, Lincoln's views at the end of the war on race as on other matters, quote, continued to be guided and restricted by his traditional view of federal relations. And he opposed legislation offered by radicals like Representative James Ashley of Ohio, introduced in December of 1864 to require the rebellious states to give full suffrage to black men. Now, if we look simply at Lincoln's policy in itself and not the man behind it, this essentially is the policy of Andrew Johnson. Like Lincoln, Johnson assumed that Reconstruction, beyond the basic measures of laying down arms, declaring loyalty, and accepting emancipation, would be self-reconstruction, led by white unionists like himself. He issued a broad amnesty and gave out pardons freely to those at first excluded. He reversed the tentative efforts of Sherman to distribute plantation lands to the freedmen. Even in the case of suffrage, his overt policy was similar to Lincoln's. In August 1865, he wrote to William Sharkey, provisional governor of Mississippi, that it would be wise for Mississippi to give the vote to all persons of color who were literate or who own real estate worth $250, requirements similar to those required for African Americans to vote in the state of New York. Otherwise, though, he left it to the newly restored governments to decide on the status of the former slaves. Now, Lincoln and Johnson, of course, were very different people. When Johnson wrote to Sharkey, his argument was that if Mississippi conferred the vote on a small number of African Americans, then, quote, the radicals who are wild upon the Negro franchise will be completely foiled in their attempts to keep the Southern states from renewing their relations to the Union by not accepting their senators and representatives. Johnson's motives, unlike Lincoln's, were cynical and crassly political, in keeping with his temperament and personality. His racism, unlike Lincoln's, was visceral. He was a provincial and limited political figure, utterly out of his depth as president. Now, no one can really know how Lincoln would have reacted to the failure of self-reconstruction in the South in 1865 and 1866, a failure dictated primarily by the deep-seated attachment of the vast majority of whites to white supremacy in almost every sphere of life. Lincoln's confidence that there was a large body of Southern white men, a real majority who were still at heart devoted to the Union, was, it turned out, quite naive. What would he have done when so many leaders of the Confederate Army and government showed up in December 1865 to take seats in Congress? Or when he realized that with the end of slavery, and thus the Three-Fifths Clause, the Constitution would reward the rebel states with more votes in Congress and the Electoral College? In the case of the freedmen, it seems to me unlikely that he would have accepted the sort of black codes passed by Mississippi, given his long-standing insistence, as he said in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, in the right to eat the bread without the leave of anybody else, which his own hand earns. The Negro is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every living man. It's hard to imagine that Lincoln would have obstinately vetoed the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, or, like Johnson, campaigned for the Southern states to reject the 14th Amendment. But it's worth remembering that even the truly radical measures of Congress in 1867 and 68, which Greg Downs has just summarized, they were not nearly as radical as they might have been. With very few exceptions, Republicans in Congress rejected confiscation and redistribution of land. They were unwilling to overturn the fundamental relationship of the states to the federal government. Even the granting of suffrage to African Americans, or more accurately, the outlawing of discrimination in voting based on race or previous condition of servitude, even that was designed to keep the policies of the Southern states in the hands of Southerners. There would still be self-reconstruction, but now, in theory, loyal Unionists would include black as well as white men. Thus, in a sense, once Georgia became the last state to have its representatives and senators seated in Congress, that was in 1871, the South was, and this again is a point Greg Downs has made, released from the grasp of war. And in a very formal sense, this was the completion of Lincoln's work as he conceived it, the restoration of the rebel states into their practical, proper relation with the Union. Republicans did not want to rule all the former Confederate states with the bayonet. And the quote from U.S. Grant said the Southern states probably should have been placed under military rule for at least 10 years, but, quote, the trouble about military rule in the South was that our people did not like it. It was not in accordance with our institutions. Now, if we switch for a few minutes from Lincoln's point of view to that of Southerners, then the work of Reconstruction, of course, was not finished in 1871. But white and black Southerners, and of course I'm leaving out all the details, white and black Southerners had very different notions of what would count as the proper practical relations of the South's citizens to either the state governments or to the national government. As the first Black Code showed, Southern whites feared black violence and were determined to make African Americans work as they always had on the plantations. Aside from that economic imperative and the fears of violence, there was the old racist views, in the words of one Mississippi planter who found it, quote, dreadfully humiliating and disgusting to have to negotiate with African Americans, to put up with their insults, their impudent demands. Whereas on their part, the formerly enslaved people began to organize even before the war ended to celebrate emancipation and call for full equality. It was a black Union sergeant, H.L. Maxwell, at a convention in Nashville, who told that meeting that he was there as an American, claiming the inalienable rights of man, including the right to the ballot box. There was a profound conflict over just who would be included in the self of self-reconstruction, a conflict that, to my mind, might be called the real central theme of Southern history for the next century. Now, we know that whites, certainly in the immediate terms, won that contest with African Americans outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outgunned. They could only prevail as long as the national government remained their strong ally, the national government and its army. But the contest did not end by any means. The work of white supremacists was not finished with the overthrow of the last state governments. We've just heard about the one in South Carolina. Again, to refer to Greg Downs, the election of 1876 and the withdrawal of troops to their barracks in 1877 was just one episode in a longer process of peeling back the federal government's authority in the former Confederate states. There remained a formidable potential for black political power, power that whites stifled with gerrymandering and various legal restrictions that are all too familiar in recent days. But if these suppressed black voting power, they did not destroy it. In Virginia, African Americans were a major part of the Readjuster Coalition in the 1880s. The state elected its first black congressman in 1888. Tennessee, which had elected one black legislator in the 1870s, elected 11 in the 1880s. Dozens of black men served in the legislatures of North Carolina, Florida, and Arkansas after 1877. It was with a sense and a fear of rising black political power that people like white Virginian Cam Pattison in 1890 reacted. He predicted in a private letter a race war when the Negroes, their heads filled by enemies of the South with meanness and impudence, would rise up with brutal and savage ferocity. Then the nation's Anglo-Saxons, both North and South, would have to respond to quickly crush that revolt. The white Southern response over the decade, as we well know, was to create a new regime, which we call Jim Crow. Segregation law to stamp people of African descent with a badge of inferiority, disfranchisement to ensure full white supremacy in politics, and tolerance, if not encouragement, of widespread violence to enforce Jim Crow in everyday life. The new black codes, we might call them, were this time accepted, sometimes endorsed by presidents, by the Congress, by the Supreme Court. It was at the end of the decades of the 1890s that the editor of the Atlantic Monthly solicited a series of essays on Reconstruction. Woodrow Wilson wrote one. William A. Dunning of Columbia University wrote another, which he called The Undoing of Reconstruction. Dunning concluded that only now, that is in 1901, was the undoing of Reconstruction nearing completion. The Atlantic's editor agreed. The final stage of the long Reconstruction controversy seems to close. Singularly enough, in the reversal of the very process which marks its inception. Reconstruction began with enfranchisement, it is ending with disfranchisement. Only now, he concluded, was Reconstruction finally over. 1 year earlier than that, Cam Pattison, who in 1890 had predicted a race war, was feeling much better. The great battle for supremacy, he said, is practically over. Whites could now afford to treat the Negro with justice, kindness, and conciliation because the Negro, quote, will become more contented when he finds, as he surely will, that he must always occupy a position subordinate to the white race. That prediction was also mistaken. Black Southerners were not content with a permanent position as subordinate to the white race. In the same Atlantic Monthly series on Reconstruction, in January 1901, a young black professor, W.E.B. Du Bois, contributed an essay on the Freedmen's Bureau. 2 years later, that essay, little changed, became chapter 2 in the Souls of Black Folk, with a new title of The Dawn of Freedom. It was in that 1901 essay that Du Bois opened and then closed with a famous sentence: "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." That problem was not what Abraham Lincoln conceived as his unfinished work. In this case, the unfinished work is still ours. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for some questions. I'm sure our panelists will be amenable to answering any questions. Yes, sir.
There was a lot of talk about reactionary white vigilante violence. What about the black response? I mean, you had black soldiers who had fought in the Union. They were being threatened. What about the state of black vigilante violence?
There's been, as you all know, a great deal of work on union leagues and other forms of paramilitary organizing. Julie Bill's work in South Carolina and among many others. And on trying to understand, as Yvonne wrote, not a question where we sort of sideline white reactionary violence as if it's the one breaking of norm in an otherwise functional system, but it is a moment where politics is fundamentally paramilitary. And so that few people are having lived in and witnessed this world turn to paramilitary politics because they understand that it's the way, in fact, perhaps the only way that they've seen politics work in the antebellum South. So you do see, while you see lots of sort of formal political engagement, debate, discussion in union leagues, you do also see in 1866 to 67 an arming and a both self-defense but also a claim of power through organizations like these.
All right, I'm back.
I'm wondering why you see the actions of the Army, for example, Mississippi. I think there were struck by how few posts there were in Mississippi in the dates that in the maps that you showed, and I'm most familiar with Mississippi anyway, so that's what I have to argue from. But I know, for instance, in 1872, I think there were exactly 700 troops in the whole state, which isn't enough to do a whole lot. And my question is, why is the Army's presence there and its attempts to cause peaceful elections revolutionary, while the white violence to destroy those elections is not called revolutionary. It seems to me that the second is the revolutionary and the first is more reformatory.
So I think a great deal turns on precise timing. So if you talk about 1872, to me that's when the revolutionary window is closed. The Army does remain in place in terms of a Republican organized national revolution. The Army does remain in place in the South, including after, as Bill mentioned, including after 1876. And the Army does police work through the 1880s. I mean, one of the odd things I think we reckon with is that it's not that I wish the Democratic Party was as bold as Thaddeus Stevens or Frederick Douglass, so that would be great. I wish they were as bold as Benjamin Harrison. You know, that our own sense of constraint is bizarre to me, given the sort of wider scope of the uses of American history. But that in the period where you do see a widespread expansion of outposts, which is 65 into the middle of 66, retraction then, and then a re-expansion in 67 to 68, is when you do have the Army moving in and asserting supervisory control and sometimes direct implementation of local governance. And that, I think, the imposition of military authority over normal processes of law is revolutionary. The way you're using it, I think you're assuming I mean revolutionary is damning. But I don't, at all. So, those would be a couple of distinctions. I do believe that the white Southern vigilante violence was a counter-revolutionary move, but I don't believe that Reconstruction was reformatory.
Thanks. Three great papers, and I just want to ask a question regarding the question of education. Greg, you say that the problem with the Army is that their attempt to educate the planters ultimately failed. And you put the date as late as 1871 that failure is occurring. But by the summer and fall of 1865, for example, the 33rd USCT Regiment is moved from Greenville, South Carolina, down to Charleston. They're attacked 3 times by paramilitaries en route. When they get from Newbury to Charleston, they can't get trains to haul them. They can't get local communities to provision them. They're starving and in disorder by the time they get to Charleston, and unsurprisingly, disorder breaks out. The unit has to be disbanded in the spring of '65. There was talk of burning Newbury, and some might say that renovation might have been progress. But I mean, ultimately, isn't the kind of constitutional changes that you're talking about a house of cards that collapses remarkably rapidly because federal forces and Southern Republicans refused to pull the trigger in a way that Republicans' enemies never hesitated to do?
It's a very profound question, and there's a couple of ways that I'll try and modulate it a little bit. One of which is I absolutely grant that I never see perfect efficacy, in this situation or others. What does strike me is a couple of things that I would add to your, very just critique or question. One of which is a set of expressions by military officials of the inefficacy of all occupations in world history up to that point. That they're sort of, what looks to us like failure can look to them like something staggeringly ambitious. And so we may well face a question in which something can be bold and transgressive and not nearly enough. And that raises, I think, a fundamental question where we might be closer to agreement, which is the extent of the challenge that they face. The part I would modulate with is that over the fall of 1865, you do get a series of commanders who argue that their numbers then, as it's between 80 and 120,000 troops in the South, that cannot create a perfect society, but it can allow them to respond and to be out in the countryside. And it's the move down into that that they believe creates a new way
to Bill, not to neglect you folks. Counterfactuals are always dangerous to play out, and we're talking about Lincoln's unfinished work, kind of like what would Kennedy have done, in Vietnam? What would Roosevelt had done at the end of World War II? What would Lincoln have done if he had lived to see the black codes? I think Northern politicians were more conservative before they saw the intention of Southern whites to re-enslave Southern blacks. And so it's difficult to figure out what Lincoln would have done based on his words and actions before that time. I tend to teach my students that just as the South starts the Civil War at Sumter, they start radical Reconstruction with the black codes. And so then you have to look at Lincoln's values at a deeper level to try to figure out what he might have done under situations that he wouldn't have imagined until the black codes actually happened.
Very good question, and since it's a counterfactual, we can always make up what we want. But let me give an example of what seems to be a plausible counterfactual. If Lincoln had lived, a 14th Amendment or its equivalent that basically includes the first famous section, perhaps with a limited term of disfranchisement of Confederate leaders, of course, canceling the Confederate debt and so forth, and the other things that mattered, together with Southern states' willingness to grant the vote to the very intelligent and former soldiers and so forth. And the reason I suggest this is that in the spring of 1867, when the Southern states realized they really screwed up and the Congress was about to bring the hammer down, the state of North Carolina proposed exactly that, a new 14th Amendment. The first clause, which we think of as the truly revolutionary point, word for word like the actual 14th Amendment. Then the other stuff, they left out the stuff about not disfranchising leaders, and then it said, and if this is passed, we pledge that the state of North Carolina will give the vote to educated and property-holding people of color. Which suggests to me that there were, I can imagine Lincoln accepting that. I can imagine enough white Southerners who realized this is the best we're going to get, accepting it. And so if I was going to try to imagine what actually might have happened, that would be sort of close to it. But again, as I said, I think the black codes would have shocked him and surprised him. But also, I mean, he was such a much better politician than Johnson. He might have convinced even the people of Mississippi, you have to not do this. But so that would be it. Yes.
I'm just going to ask a very, very quick nuts and bolts question. Professor Morris, as I'm listening to your story, and it's quite a story, obviously, hopefully will not be repeated in our own time on any level. What are the nuts and bolts of actually voting on Election Day in a state like South Carolina in 1876? What do you have to do? What happens under normal circumstances?
I don't know all of the nuts and bolts, but it's my understanding there are a lot of different reasons. A lot of common election fraud, including anti-Semitic when they were already at the top of the candidates altogether. So you see the word you might be able to read or recognize and vote for on the wrong slate. Why are they different colors? I don't know. They have been. Yeah.
They were typically printed out and you were given a ballot by the party and you stuck it in a box.
Piece over. But the other aspect is it was widely accepted in congressional hearings about elections that a man had to demonstrate normal physical courage in order to claim that he had been prevented from voting. That meant he had to try to fight his way in. If he tried to fight his way in and then didn't get in, then there could be a complaint. But that if you were intimidated or barred, then that was considered that you had not really actually. So they were, as Julie Saville says, at best wrestling matches, under a good order and under bad order.
You have holes surrounded by not horsemen. You have voting boxes put at the top of a staircase, the access for the bottom, which is cool. You know, on the other side, you have what gossamer ballots, where you might have 10 really thin ballots that one person's able to cast, and they sort of separated in the box.
We have time for last two questions.
This is actually the same question as was asked a few times earlier, but maybe with a little bit more point. We hear a lot about murders. We hear a lot about murders of Republicans and blacks. We hear about a few deaths of Democrats as byproducts of the larger murders, but we don't hear about murders of Democrats. Were there any?
Well into the 1890s, I believe, and wrote some reflections. Can we draw any inferences or conclusions about his maybe second guessing the way things played out in South Carolina?
I haven't followed him that far. He was an interesting guy. I mean, he was a friend of abolitionists, ends up as a cooperationist, and I mean, I think he saw the path to continuing the plan of Reconstruction as being a cooperationist, as sort of heading off the most violent arm of the conservatives who still weren't calling themselves Democrats by incorporating them into his government. So I really do feel like that was the path that he saw forward, and it was radicals within his own party, largely led by the African Americans, who pushed the envelope farther than he was willing to take it.
All right, let's give a hand of applause for our three guests.